Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our RTS podcast. Something we've been meaning to do for a while here, but alas, we have it now. We'll be talking about RTS games, something that I hope to do at least somewhat frequently, but for now at least, we're going to be talking about game length in RTS and Company of Heroes 2. It seems like a pretty simple topic, but I think there actually can be a lot of said about the game length, and a lot of things stem from that as a result. So today I have three wonderful guests joining me from the RTS community, maybe mainly from Company of Heroes 2. Just quickly, I'm a shoutcaster for Company of Heroes, Command & Conquer Generals, and a bunch of other games such as Starcraft 2 on the side. Bit of a full disclosure as well, I'm currently in contract with Relic for the Warpaint Championship, so I need to be well behaved, but I think I can be very, very critical in terms of the analysis of Company Heroes, which is exactly what I'm planning to do here. As for you, Tenchi, who the hell are you?
I'm Tenshi, and I live in Stockholm, Sweden. I work mainly as a Company Heroes Starcraft 2 caster, and I've recently gotten into casting Company of Heroes together with the machine. I cast Counter-Strike Global Offensive as well. That is like the second game that I do, and on the side of that, I work closely with DreamHack as a tournament admin and stage manager, and other organizations that host mainly StarCraft 2 events. That's me.
Helping Hands?
Hi, I'm Helping Hands. I like to just consider myself a professional Company Heroes 2 player at the top end of my game. I am also trying StarCraft 2, getting into that now, and I've done some casting and help out with the community, trying to give them tips and advice on improving the game. Living up to my name.
Hey!
I like Tenchi. Yeah, that's me.
Magpie?
Hey guys, I'm firstly a caster. I live in Bristol, England. I mostly cast Company of Heroes 2, but I've been following StarCraft 2 since the beta. It's a game that I love and I know a fair bit about, I like to think, so yeah.
Yeah, so I wanted to choose a bunch of people that have a lot of experience in different RTS games. I think also shoutcasters are especially the best people to be doing RTS critique, because we are the people that really need to try and hype up an RTS game. We are the people that analyze firsthand what makes RTS games exciting and interesting and fun to play. And then I wanted to have Helping Hans on board because he is as he said, one of the top Company Heroes 2 players, so he should have a pretty valuable insight in terms of how the game length affects him playing in tournaments and the running of tournaments themselves. So how this podcast is going to work, this is our first podcast, so it's probably going to be a little bit rough around the edges. Won't be too formal, but at least there's a few discussion points that I have that I'll be mentioning, and then I'll hand it out to these guys to give their thoughts on the conversation at hand. So the first thing that I want to mention about Company of Heroes, which is very interesting from a design perspective, is that the game length is very manipulatable. It's a tricky word, manipulatable. It's a real word though, and what that means is that because the Company of Heroes 2 game length is set by the victory points, more or less. The fact that 500 victory points, the game ends when you hit 0, that's what really is the catalyst and what results in games ending. Whereas most other RTS games, it's just more when you kill your opponent. So it's a bit less, you can't change it as much, it's not as customizable. And so the thing is with Company of Heroes 2 then, with the VPs, is it makes it very deliberate. Why is Company of Heroes 2 500 VPs? Why is it not 250 or 1,000? Or why do the VPs tick at the rate that they do? And I mean, the first thing really is because it's the same as Company Heroes 1. So, we can't be too creative with that. It's basically the same as Company Heroes 1. But why is Company Heroes 1 then? Why is it set to that 500 VPs? And I think the reason why is because then it gives you the progression of teching and compositions. So then, because the way the Company Heroes works is you go from infantry to support weapons to light vehicles to medium tanks to heavy tanks. And by having 500 VPs, then you're able to go through that progression and have access to all those units. Where if you were to reduce the VPs to say 250, a lot of the times you wouldn't get past your tier 3 or your tier 4. So do you have any thoughts on this, any of you guys?
Who wants to start?
Hans, you can start first.
Yeah, go for it, Hans.
Okay, so yeah, the game does seem like it goes on for quite a long time. And a good thing in Company Heroes 1, which helped games be a little bit shorter, was the fact that the population cap was tied to how many territories you controlled. So if somebody went for a cut-off maneuver, that would restrict their opponent's pop cap, and they couldn't produce any more resources, which would severely hamper their efforts in playing the game. That would result in quicker games. I'm also interested, just thought about this now, that in all the Company Heroes games there are base defenses. I'm curious as to see if they were removed, how the game would be, because then it would encourage a lot more base rushes. Because currently you just don't get that. I mean, you might find like you might get an M20 that chases down a sniper into a person's base, but you don't really ever see really early base rushes at all, because those base MGs are there to stop that happening.
Yeah, so I think what Hans is basically saying is that, like, because of how fortified the bases are, it removes the minimum game length. The VPs, I think, are a great way of giving you a maximum game length. You don't want a game going for hours on end. And if Company Heroes 2 didn't have VPs, if it was only Annihilate, it'd be boring as hell. It would go for hours on end. But something that Company Heroes 2 doesn't have is it doesn't really give you a means to end the game without without VP. So you can't really annihilate your opponent just by destroying their buildings or killing all their units because of how fortified their bases are. Anything to add, Tenchi?
Yeah, I think I'm really glad that Hans brought up the whole thing with base defense, because it's kind of like slipped my mind. Of course, coming from a background of heavy Starcraft, of course there is going to be like some sort of generally just like a knowledge bias naturally, but I think that that's one of the like important dynamics of a game like Starcraft, which is something that I think is very important if you want to have and maintain a competitive real-time strategy game. That you have the early game, the mid game, and the late game. In all of these stages of the game, there are different kinds of like dangers that you always have to be aware of. Like in Company of Heroes, in the early stages, like if you're playing as OKW, and let's say you go for your battle group headquarters, then you always have to be wary about like light vehicles. Of course, you can get the Raketenwerfer, but I hope that I'm not like digressing too much. Maybe that's just like a bad.
I would argue that StarCraft has the same sort of thing because StarCraft has the ramps.
Yeah, but I mean, it's like, but that's a map design thing. You don't have the base defense, so there are like several strategies that in the early stages of the game that like you have to be very on point with like how you read the game or like how you read your opponent. Whereas in Company of Heroes, there isn't really any sort of threat that can easily kill you in the early stages of the game. Just as long as you play fairly passively and you play safe and like you don't dance around in and out of buildings. I mean, there's not going to really be a lot of drastic change to how the map, how the pace of the game changes.
There's no way you can lose the game. You cannot lose the game.
Yeah, exactly. And
under
and
20
I think
minutes.
I think that's a bad thing for a competitive RTS, because it removes the viability, of course, of any early game rushes, but it also removes like an interesting strategical approach that like there are certain players who excel at this like scrappy, weird early game kind of aggression that you see in StarCraft 2 that are like notorious for going for these super cheesy strats, and then they suck in the late game, and that can make some really interesting styles, when they clash. Whereas in Company of Heroes, it for me it kind of stagnates very quickly, and I think it gets rather uninteresting faster than I want it to.
Magpie?
Yeah, I'm really glad as well that Hans brought up the base defenses thing, because that was something I was gonna mention as well. I think like personally, like ages and ages ago, like the dawn of RTS in my life, we used to play Command and Conquer Red Alert, and we also used to play the original Homeworld. And the big difference between the two, excitement level wise, is that in Command and Conquer Red Alert, the game felt like it was alive. Like you could win or lose, like pretty much from the second minute onwards, But in Homeworld, you started off with this massive mothership, which had base defense turrets and a lot of HP. So even if you had an overwhelming advantage in the first 20 minutes of the game, you couldn't really close it out until you had the high-tech units to actually seal the deal. And like that made you feel less excited, less empowered as a player. The adrenaline isn't really there. And that translates to viewers as well and casters. It's genuinely hard to make a game that exciting when the possibilities and the potential for exciting actions is like necessarily reduced. So yeah, I think it's massive. I think if we even just reduced like the health of the starting building that you have and got rid of the base defense bunkers, then that would present an alternate means to victory in Company of Heroes 2, which I would welcome, because at the moment I agree it's a problem that games take this long.
I'd also like to add that, for instance, Americans and Soviets have the ability to demo buildings, and that would be quite a quick way to take down buildings. Whereas the Axis do not. They have Axis. One commander has Goliaths. Hostages don't have that. Full stop. I think, as a general rule, maybe all factions should have like a ability to put down like a high explosive that would quickly take down a building if it were was planted to enable maybe possibly the game to end quicker via base destruction.
It seems.
Yeah, I think that. Sorry, go on.
I was going to say, I think it seems interesting that you even need base defense, because the thing is, you can reinforce in your base. So you'd think that it would be impossible to kill your opponent, because you can reinforce from your base. And I suppose if your opponent had a half track, then they could reinforce in your base as well, and then that would be pretty overpowered. So it's kind of like the base defense is unnecessary for Company of Heroes to work, but it does mean that you always have a minimum game length, and that makes it a bit less interesting, because even if someone gets completely outplayed, they won't lose the game. They're just gonna like eventually lose in 10 minutes time, which is then it's not as climatic.
It's like it's fun to compare these two games, because I mean they are fundamentally very different by design. But one of the things that I like personally really enjoy as a spectator of StarCraft, and I've recently been watching a lot of Company of Heroes as well, it's the whole thing of, generally you have a very stable metagame. There's probably not going to be a lot of risk-taking stuff, but then all of a sudden, at match point, this guy busts out I don't know, like a 13-13, like a quick gas, quick pool of Zerg, and tries to end the game quickly. There's nothing like that in Company of Heroes. You're at match point, everything on the line, and then, well, guys, we're going to have another 45-minute game on our hands, There's no excitement to that, and it just keeps it very uninteresting. There's no build or strategy dynamic in Company of Heroes like there is in StarCraft 2. And, like, that's what I think is really lacking. And so as Hans was touching upon that, the whole thing with you have the ability to drop down charges or something like that to deal with static buildings. That is, to me, a fundamental design flaw that I think is a big issue with Relic. You and I have talked about this previously, Callum, that they want to keep everything diverse, but I think like in this quest to keep things different, to keep it quote unquote interesting, they have forsaken game balance and like given all of these factions the ability to achieve the same things for like a similar amount of resources or a similar amount of time spent.
Yeah, I feel like that's
a really big issue.
It's not quite related to the game length that we're talking about, but it's certainly a good point, though.
But I mean, it's just like fundamentally the whole thing with Company of Heroes, like the main issue that also correlates to game length is just fundamental design philosophy from Relic's point of view.
I think it does. I think Tenshi's point is actually related to game length as well, though. I think it's actually a really good point. Is that like, I don't know, like I think that like basic functions have to be available to all the factions, and putting down demo charges, having a forward retreat point, in my opinion, these are basic functions that shouldn't be differentiated. And I think Relic just like underestimate like what basic functions should count as, and they should just allow a few more things to be accessible to all factions. And if that would enable players to have like a lot more difference in the builds that they could do and like the strategies they could employ, specifically in like early game aggression, I think that would be really healthy for the game and would probably reduce the amount of time that games take.
Thing is, those demo traps are actually, with demolition charges, are actually really bad against the HQ. Like, it takes about 3 demos to kill a HQ. So I think that's not even the biggest problem. I think the underlying
but
problem
that could be addressed, right?
Well, I think
mean,
the overlying
to deal with buildings.
Yeah, but I think it more comes down to the fact that the buildings are just really durable. If you have a Panzer IV in someone's base, it takes you probably about a minute, if not more, of a Panzer IV to kill a HQ. I feel like if the buildings were much lower, then you'd be able to close the game out. I think it's especially more of an issue in team games. In a 4v4, you say you have one person that drops out, so it's like a 3v4, but it just takes so long to end the game, even with a triple cap. You should be able to just go into your opponent's base if you have that much of an advantage, because if you are base rushing your opponent, you have to be really far ahead. It's not going to be a close game if you're base rushing your opponent, so you should be able to just kill them very quickly and end the game. I think it would also make the game less campy, because if you just camp 2 VPs, then okay, you camp the 2 VPs, bro. I'll just go destroy your base and you'll lose the game. So it would make it even a bit more active as well. But because kind of what the original point that I brought up is that the VPs is very manipulatable. And this is the same thing with Dawn of War 2, is the fact that you don't annihilate your opponent. Like you never end a game by killing your base. It's always VPs. But in Dawn of War 2, a game that's very similar in terms of the resources and the mechanics, but the VPs tick. I'm pretty sure it's twice as fast. The VPs tick down twice as quickly as Company Heroes 2. So the games go for much shorter. They go for at most, the longest game you'll see is pretty much half an hour. So do you think reducing how fast VPs would go down, would that benefit the game, Hans?
Well, I'm worried if you make the amount of VPs or smaller or reduce it or make the tick rate faster, then it'll take the late game, getting into like the heavy tanks and stuff. But you won't see that as often. So I'm not sure how you would kind of balance that out, so that you would always, because with Company Heroes around about the 30-minute mark, you probably could get your King Tiger or whatever out and this kind of thing. But normally, if it's a very big slugfest and both players are very evenly matched, it can go on for quite a while. And if the VPs were smaller, then I fear that we wouldn't see the late game tech. I know there is a mod currently in the game that I think one of the Relic balance designers made, which was where there were 100 VPs per side, or was it 50? I can't remember. And you had a certain amount of resources, and then you had all attack available, and then it was just like go, right? Everybody had a chance to go, and I thought that was a really good idea. So maybe something more like that. I mean, developed obviously a bit more would be a good idea. I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
I think 400 VPs would be a sweet spot. Or rather, you rescale the ticking down to, say, make it 500 VPs still, but they tick at the rate of, say, 400 VPs. I think that would draw out the... it wouldn't draw out the games as long, but I'll let Tenchi have a discussion.
I feel that I'm always like I'm like a broken record, but I really feel that all of these things, like I think almost every single issue with Company is like game length. Consider like German armor is really strong in late game. You get access to the Jagdtiger, you get all of the the King Tiger and stuff like that. That's what you see in the later stages of the game. If you shorten the game length, then you're probably not going to see that as much, which of course would make things a little less interesting, because it's always fun to see like different compositions clash. But the main issue again comes down to just like fundamental design, because at that point in the game, it's past the point where you just look at the VPs and say, okay, look at the tick rate, say, how are they doing? Have we seen all of the tech yet? Like, yeah, sure, we have. But you have to consider the things like, how strong are all of these units? Like, how do they scale with veterancy in the late game if you've maintained these units? And then...
so you're talking about balance implications.
The utility. Yeah, because that's something you have to consider. Like, in StarCraft, you don't really... Like, game length can vary, but you will generally always have an average game length depending on map size. Like a map like Frost, for instance, which is a 4-player map. It's pretty big. I think it's the biggest map in the map pool right now in StarCraft 2. You will generally have a longer game on that one depending on spawn locations. If you get cross spawns on that map, then yeah, it's a lot more often that you'll have a game that goes on between 15 and 20 minutes. And then if it goes past that without any like big changes going on in the game, then you can easily go up to like 30, 45. But otherwise, on a smaller map, you'll generally have the same like amount of time, unless there's anything crazy going on. And that's just the map in itself, sort of setting the pace of the game.
Yeah, so you're saying that...
Whereas I feel the pacing drastically changes depending on what kind of units you have on the field.
Yeah, there's a good point that you bring up, is the game length. It does affect the balance, and the maps as well. So it's something that we can talk more later on. But Magpie, so do you think that the VPs should be draining quicker, or there should be less VPs? Like, how do you feel that the overall game length of Company of Heroes 2, do you like the current game length, or what would you rather see it reduced?
I'm going to say that I don't like the current game length, and then I'm going to give you a total cop-out answer and say that I'm not a game designer. Like basically, I can see that there are several totally doable routes to reducing game time. As you say, you can reduce the number of VPs, you can have them tick higher, you can totally change it so you start off, there's no income or anything. You just, like Hans was saying, there's a developer mod out there where you just get X amount of resources and 100 VPs, and it's just go, do your thing, fight, and get it over and done with. You could
Sounds
come up
like
with like a middle
Blitzkrieg mod
ground where
for
like
Company Heroes 1.
yeah, like, and you could even have it where there's no VPs, but if you manage to hold all 3 of the victory points on the map for 1 minute continuously, you win, and have bases be softer so you can attack the main as well for this kind of like two-pronged style of game. There are tons of different ways of making the game shorter and having it be totally cool and viable, and people will like it. The trouble is, the game as it's presently set up is completely balanced for games to be the length that they presently are. So all the veterancy requirements, the unit costs, the unit abilities and relative power levels are all designed to basically take as long as they take and make a game go as long as they do. So I think you basically, at a pretty early stage in the game, you have to make a design choice. How long do I want this game to go? And honestly, I think for Company of Heroes 2, we're like past the point where that can ever be redressed. It's still a very interesting discussion in my mind, which is why, I'm here and it's really cool to be talking to you guys about it. But I actually think that like we're not really talking about fixing Company of Heroes 2. I think that there are so many viable routes, but I think it needs a new game, if that makes sense.
I would
So-
disagree. I mean, I'm personally working on a mod that that
Yeah, I
changes a
know.
lot of the things, but I think we should talk about this in a bit more detail. Is how the different factions and different units are stronger at different stages of the game, and I feel like that's personally a massive flaw in the game design. I feel like the fact that you have OKW that have 5 levels of veterancy. So they take longer to vet up, but they get much stronger bonuses, especially when you look at elite infantry like Obersoldaten that have suppressing fire at vet 4, and you have non-doctrinal King Tigers. So it means that OKW are just objectively stronger late game. So you were saying that Company of Heroes 2 is balanced for its current game length, but I mean I would disagree because it's not balanced for its current game length, because you have some factions stronger at different stages, and likewise you have US that have they get free scores when they tech up, and they have very potent vehicles, so they have a lot of mid-game pressure. So
you make a really good point, but like I would just counter to say that like the faction design and being balanced for a specific game length in my mind are two different things, because the factions being strong at different points throughout the game kind of still means that they're balanced in a sort of weird relic way that we know doesn't lead to that much interaction and doesn't lead to exciting comebacks and things. And we would like it that all of the factions are equally potent at all phases in the game, because, well, I think it's safe to say that would make for a better game, and I think that we can see that now. But I don't know, I kind of feel like the factions are like kind of weirdly balanced in their own way. But I do totally take your point. I think if you're going to change game length and things like that, you do need to give the factions a complete go over.
I just find them to be like I just find okay, now this is something that I've said many times, so I'm not going to be like stuttering and sound like a fucking complete idiot when I'm saying this. It's the whole thing for me, which is the main issue with Company of Heroes. Not only as a player, when I play myself, I'm like pretty shit at the game, but my point still stands. It's that you have these units. Axis units are, like you brought up, the veterancy 5 of OKW makes them insanely powerful when you A move them blindly like an idiot. Whereas with the USF, which to me are a very well designed, all well-rounded faction, you have so much utility, you have so many micro decisions you can make. And whereas two King Tigers, like a King Tiger A moving over you is like, yeah, it's going to be hard to stop in the A moving wars, but when I have the potential to use rifle smoke, I can use rifle grenades, I can switch my load on my Sherman to high explosive and AP to kill the supporting infantry. I have so much additional utility so that I can use my mechanical, so I can use my mechanics and my strategy to work around an issue.
So how does that tie into game length?
Those options don't exist to some factions, which means that they have to try to go and like stupidly A move some units towards a VP, because they're under a lot of pressure. You just don't have the same like options in terms of how to use your compositions, which
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, go on. No, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, I reckon you're making like a really good point. It boils down to options, and like the more options you have, the more possibilities there are for games to end earlier.
Yeah.
And I think at the moment, like for the German players, like if you're just better in the late game, then it basically doesn't matter as long as you kind of survive. And that sort of makes it really boring to watch, because like as intense as the early game might be, the German players basically just playing to get to the late game with like 150 VPs and then like win with bigger, better units. And it's like, I don't know. That just doesn't feel so exciting to watch or like be part of, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good point. Is even if you completely outplay your opponent, as US, you often can close the game. Not because the game ends, just because your opponent quits because they have no units left. But as Axis, you know, what is playing well as Axis look like in the early game? It means you have 50% of the map. Like playing well as Axis means I have half of the map. And if the factions were more balanced in the early and at all the stages of the game, then if Axis did outplay the Allies, then maybe that would end up in more early surrenders and more early GGs. Anything to add, Hans?
I think they're all really good points. I'm just trying to think about. Yeah, I think like allies definitely have. I find like in the early game and the mid game advantages. Yeah, definitely Axis games. If we look at the statistics, I'm sure like OKW and Austere would be winning more, more of the games that go into maybe the 40, 50, 60-minute stages of games. They're the ones normally, who win. However, there are still many possible ways that allies could beat with superior micro, through use of smoke. For instance, hardly anybody, uses smoke that effectively. And with good placement of smoke, you can totally wreck, even superior units because like five Opus Dalton can't shoot through smoke. You could then use your ISU to then one shot the unit through the smoke and blow it up, that kind of thing. And you might have all these abilities that you can use to your advantage, like mark target and all these. So I definitely think that yes, Axis do tend to win it more often. I would say an average skill player, if you put two average players together, the Axis player in the late game would probably win. But if you had two very good players together, I definitely think it would be an equal fight, even though Axis would have probably the advantage in the late game.
Okay, well, I think we can move on to another point, which is definitely related to the game length, and is something that I think Helping Hans especially can relate to. Is the problem is when you have an RTS game that has a very long game length. Company Heroes 2 games, they can and they do go up towards an hour. It can put a bit of a strain on tournaments and
yes.
Through quite a few different perspectives as well. Us as shoutcasters, Hans as a player, viewers that are watching the game, as well as even just the admins that are trying to set up like a schedule. How do you try and allot for game length when you have a best of 3 series? How long does it go for? And basically, it means that you can't have. I guess we'll start from the player's perspective. Is that you can't have long series in terms of best of 7, best of 9s, because if you have a best of 9 series for Company of Heroes 2, it could potentially go for 9 hours, which is just ridiculous for a single series. And the thing is with series is it's so important to have multiple games, because in any RTS game you're always going to have bad games where you just make mistakes, you throw the game, and that can ruin it for you completely. Whereas a lot of other games, StarCraft 2 or 0 Hour, in particular, you can have crazy long best of 9 series, and they actually don't even go for that long. It's still maybe an hour, 2 hours for 9 games, but it does give players a lot of chance for different strategies to make mistakes and still come back, so long as they play better overall. So how do you feel about this, Hans?
Well, I definitely can relate to that, because when I remember doing, for instance, OCF, Operation Charlie Fox tournament, the entire competition I think lasted for that one day, and it lasted a ridiculous 10 hours or more, and it was the entire length of the tournament because it was so long. I think a work around this could be just do like the first 2 rounds for each weekend. Maybe that might be a bit too long. It might take a whole month to complete one tournament, but I think that would be more it would be easier on the players, because it's very difficult to sit, and the viewers as well, because you don't have that amount of time just to sit down there and watch maybe your favorite game for like 4 hours or so, maybe 1 or 2 hours at max. So yeah, definitely I would think maybe it's just the tournament organizing limit, maybe 2 rounds for a certain day and then move on, so players have a break and the viewers have a break, as well as the casters or what have you. Also in Co, though, you have each player, unlike StarCraft, has to play 2 different factions. StarCraft, you could just play Protoss, Zerg, or whatever. Whereas Co, you've got to play Allies and Axis. You've got to choose at least 2 factions and master them both, and you have to take turns, because to see who's the better player, both needs an equal chance, as both Allies and Axis to defeat their opponents. You have that as well. You've got to consider. So yeah, that's what I think about that.
I'm just curious though, because like this struck me last night or yesterday. Like, why don't they simply have mirrors in Company of Heroes? Because you can set it up in custom games, right? And like,
Yeah.
regardless of what people think, like, oh well, it's not accurate having Germans fighting Germans. I mean, if you want to like nitpick and stuff, there are times that I can cite where Germans fought Germans, but why isn't mirrors a thing? Wouldn't that do? I mean, I think that would probably do something, to affect game length, right? Like if you have OKW versus OKW, two factions that are generally very aggressive, that move out on the map and not very static kind of play. Um,
Mm.
I don't know.
For Co, personally, I feel like a lot of the community is very. They strongly feel for the historical reasons.
They
for
like the
allies,
role-playing.
but yeah, they like the role play a lot. I agree with that. Yeah, they don't like to see Axis versus Axis, and it just for me personally as well, I wouldn't like to see that. Even though yes, it might be interesting to see it, or it might make the gameplay but it's a different game. Co 2, it's allies versus Axis, and Starcraft 2. It makes more sense to the lore as well. Starcraft, because you might have rogue factions fighting each other, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But with Co, yes, and I do agree with you. There were some moments in history where the Axis fought Axis and that kind of thing. But generally speaking, I definitely think that it's just allies versus Axis, and it should stick to that. And it wouldn't. And also, I would bring up the point. Wouldn't be as interesting. If you just saw the same units fight each other, it'd be like, oh, okay. Where's the variety? And I think a considerable number of people might find that to be a bit boring to see the same factions go at it.
Yeah, the factions, they're not really designed to be versing each other, and I think it's just boring. Whenever I play any RTS, really, I find that mirror matchups are generally pretty boring. I don't enjoy playing them as much. You see the same units over and over again.
Heresy.
Well, look, I mean, if you were a Terran player, you would know that it's just Marine tank
TVT
medevac,
is
Marine
my
tank
second
medevac.
favorite
Really?
matchup. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
but
It's amazing. TVT
but
is
that's the
amazing.
thing. Yeah, TVT is a really good matchup. Like if you have two high tier players, like that's important to mention that you like we're talking like top of the line kind of players. When you have guys that have got all of these fundamentals down, and it only comes down to like decision making and positioning and all of these like smaller things. Any mirror matchup in StarCraft 2 can become really, really, really good. And that's just
we're
how the game
digressing
is
a little
made.
bit here.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
Yes,
when it's
we are.
as soon as you go and open up the can of like, should we have mirror matches in Code 2? That's like that is a big old can
Yeah.
of worms right there.
It does definitely
Um,
relate to making the esports a little bit difficult, though. But that's even then, it's a
Yeah.
different subject entirely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm trying to not digress, but I experienced that
Yeah,
I'm being really
me too.
fucking bad at not. So
I would love to just close
Take
though.
the
I'd
reins,
just love to
boys.
close. Like, I feel like I have a tiny bit of insight into this, which is that I came to Company of Heroes 2 from StarCraft and all that thing, and I didn't even know that mirror matches were not a thing in Company of Heroes 2. So when I was first playing it, I would play against all my friends, and we would play Ostia versus Ostia. We'd play Soviets versus Soviets, and well, those were the only factions at that time. So we used to play a lot of mirror matches, and they were fine. I kid you not, they were really fun. Like, they were just really good. We enjoyed them a lot. I just thought I'd just mention that is true. Ostia versus Ostia is a work of art.
There'd be a lot of balance issues, like US would run all over British, pretty hardcore. But anyway, so that's
true, yeah.
definitely when it comes to the game length, it does make it hard for the players. Because it's
that's right.
draining
That's what we
physically. Yeah. Magpie, if you want to add something, by all means.
If I may just quickly say, yeah, as a caster, like having to sign over like at least 9 hours realistically to cover some of those like what was the ESL tournaments that we were doing?
Yeah.
Those were like
Yep.
that was a big amount of time because that was basically your Sunday just like totally nuked. And yeah, I loved it, and yeah, I'd rather not be anywhere else, but I'd rather also be able to do like maybe 3-hour casts than like 1 9-10 hour
Yeah.
cast.
Yeah.
It's definitely draining as a spectator, and I feel like that's one of the great things about the Warpaint Championship lately is that it has been split up. We've had the opening rounds.
Yeah, that's definitely. I as a player, sorry to interrupt. I definitely appreciate that as well because I don't feel as much pressure, and then I've got time also to then analyze my next opponent
Yeah.
as well, which is another point.
Oh, that's true.
to add.
Yeah, and streaming for 9 hours is kind of ridiculous. So it's good to do that, but yeah, and then it's not just the time; it's the best of series are very short, and it can be quite frustrating for you have 2 games to decide it, especially when you swap factions, and if you have one faction that's kind of overpowered, you really only have one shot. Like if you lose this game as allies, then you're out of the tournament, it puts the lethality a bit high.
Yeah.
So I feel like kind of bringing it back to the overall topic, which what I'm trying to do here, because we can talk about all these specific issues in different podcasts, but I feel like if you were to make the VPs tick faster, say the VPs ticked at 300 or down to 400, 300, then you could actually do a best of 5 series. And it might go for the same amount of time, and then that would make it a lot more interesting for the players, make it more fair for them as well. So, I would love to see the game speed up. But I think you have to obviously rebalance the factions, but good because they need to rebalance anyway.
Yep.
So then one of the next points that I'll kind of mention is it's very map dependent. And that's easily fixable, but I feel like you have some maps like Lungris Kaya or Angoville, those are the main two, in 1v1 at least, is that because of the VP layout, it makes it very hard to secure all 3 VPs. And so then you basically just have a double cap the entire game, and it drags it out much more than it needs to. Whereas most maps, the VPs are even for both players, so you can triple cap if you're actually outplaying your opponent. Anything to add? That's a pretty self-explanatory point, though.
Yeah, for instance, if you got like houses on top of a VP, it's a lot easier to defend that location. And if one VP is closer to a certain person's base, and then they can just jump in that house, that VP's locked down for that person, and the same on the other side, that one's locked down. And then it's just like a fight for the middle one, which lasts forever.
Yeah.
Like Language Sky.
Yeah.
So I'd just say to fix that, like you say, just change the maps, maybe remove the houses near VPs so it's a bit more easy to grab them, or make it just that kind of thing.
I think there's a bit of flexibility that you can do. Like if you guys remember the old Kolodny Winter, there was 2 VPs up north, so you could camp 2 VPs. But the thing is with that is the south, they only had 1 VP. They actually had more resources. They had like a fuel point and more points. So I feel like you can make 2 VPs kind of in one spot, because then you're punished because there's more resources. Whereas with Angoville, it's not that case at all. The left and the right side, I'm pretty sure they have identical resources. It just the right side happens to have another VP, and they're both so close to the player's base. So I mean that's a pretty simple topic there. And the next point that I bring up, which is we sort of mentioned it as well, is the fact that in StarCraft and 0 Hour, because you just don't know what to expect. Will this game end in 5 minutes? Will it be a cheese? Will this game go for a half an hour macro game? It means that there's a lot more tension. There's a lot more surprises that can be happened. Will the opponent push out and close the game? Will he go for the macro? By Company Heroes 2 having such a long minimum game time, because it's not just the fact that Company Heroes 2 has a long maximum game time, it also has a long minimum game time. I feel like the bigger issue is actually the minimum game time is very high. So then you don't have those weird series where players pull out crazy strategies and cheese each other because there's different ways to close games out.
Yeah, I would just bring up the base defenses again with that.
Yeah.
I mean, if there was no base defenses, people, because for instance, if you kill all your opponent's forces, then you've got to wait until you've got a half track or you've got a vehicle that can destroy a building, and then you can go in and finish him off before because you can't wait for the VPs to run out because that'll take too long. So yeah, I'd just say maybe again allow all factions to have demos on HQ so you can upgrade it, and remove base defenses, or make it a lot easier to get into opponent's base, like a blind spot. I know there used to be a couple of blind spots in certain maps where you could sneak around the back of an opponent's base to get in and demo something. So yeah, I would say those couple of points for that.
Anything else to add, guys?
Just a big +1 like. I agree.
Yeah.
Minimum game length is way too long.
Okay.
No, yeah. I think
So another point that I can mention as well is what I find happens in Company of Heroes 2 is the priorities are very inconsistent. And what I mean by that is because the VPs tick very slowly, it means that the VPs in the early game don't actually matter that much. Whereas in the early game, it's all about getting the fuel advantage and getting the cutoff. And this is, you could argue it's a good or a bad thing, but it means that in the early game, you kind of ignore VPs, you go for the fuel. And the late game is the opposite, because often if you're pop capped especially, or the thing holding you back is manpower bleed more than fuel, then instead it's all about VPs and not so much about fuel. Whereas if the VPs were to tick down faster, then you would have a bit more consistency in terms of prioritizing fuel cutoff VP munitions. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. Yeah, I definitely feel like as a player, I don't normally go for the VPs straight away. It's always prioritize resources as that normally dictates how the game's going to go. I'd like to see, yeah, if VPs would tick down faster, it would be add another element to it. So where players would feel like maybe it might be important to might rush my MG to defend the middle VP on Samoski early instead of rushing the cutoff, because if it gets ticked down, then I'm going to be way behind. I won't have enough time to catch up on VPs, but even if I have the tech advantage, for instance.
It creates more opportunity cost and decision making.
Yeah.
Tenchi, Magpie.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that would definitely be something that could potentially be worth implementing, or like trying out in some sort of custom mod, because it would give players an incentive to. You'd have more. Company of Heroes is all about like having the small engagements and stuff like that, and a lot of like multitasking, but it would give players a more short-term incentive that is also going to be impacting the entirety of the game, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Whereas, like Han said, it's just about resources, mainly fuel, in fact. And you mentioned this, like where you had the two VPs to the top, but you had more resources in the bottom. Because of how the VP tick is rather slow now. If you're playing Axis, you go down and you grab the resources, and then you just turtle those resource points until late game, where you can get out your heavy armor. That sort of makes the game stagnate, right? Like in terms of pacing. So like you'd always have, at least to me, it would make sense as an Axis player to do that, for example, and that's kind of what I would say we want to avoid generally, because that means that if we have something that is ever changing, it'll be a lot more interesting.
Magpie, anything to add before we move on?
Yeah, the only thing I would say that I didn't think about earlier, what you just said, if you increase the tick rate on the VPs, that actually does change how valuable they are, like right in the early game and the mid game, which at the moment, as you were saying, they're not very valuable at all. And as a caster, as a player, I'd be really interested to see what that would be like. I'm not like sufficiently skilled to like hypothesize how that might make the game look, but I'm definitely interested in seeing that. It would be nice to see those points be worth more earlier.
I don't even think you have to be that imaginative to see how would it affect the game. Just look at Dawn of War 2. Like, Dawn of War 2 is a crazy fast-paced game. The VPs tick down so fast that it makes a lot of things way more complicated. You have to really decide, do I want to hold my power? Do I want to attack my opponent's power? Do I want to, go for the VPs instead? And it makes like mass retreats way more punishing, which then indirectly would make blobbing more harder, because if you mass retreat, you lose the VPs, and that's like actually a big deal.
Yep.
Also, in terms of in Dawn of War 2, like a lot of the times, you don't have the time to fully heal your squads. In Dawn of War 2, like the squads, especially if you're something like Space Marines that have a lot of health and not many models, you actually heal in base very slowly. So a lot of times you have to send out your squads with 2/3 health, just because you can't afford to lose the VP, you can't afford to lose your power. So it creates a lot more difficult decision making and a lot more tension, because the lethality of VPs is so much higher. Then you have to consider them in and weigh them up between different types of territory and things like that. So we'll move on. Another point that I do want to actually talk about here, or rather let Magpie talk about, is Deserts of Karak. Deserts of Karak it sort of has a system similar to Company of Heroes. It has an artifact retrieval mode. If you want to talk about artifact retrieval mode and how you think it affects the game.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so artifact retrieval is like an objective system. There are usually.
Am I missing something?
No, sorry, just because I don't have experience with Deserts of Karak. Could you just like explain the basic function of how it is, just like generally?
Yeah, sure.
Because I have no idea.
Okay, sure. So, okay, it's an RTS game. It's probably like most similar stylistically to, like, I don't know. Did you ever play Ruse or a War Game or anything like that? It's like a semi-realistic. You can zoom all the way from SATCAM to like zooming straight into the battle kind of thing. But it's also really, really streamlined. Like, it is fast. The micro is furious, and every decision matters in the same way that it feels like it matters in Starcraft. Like the builds can be as lethal and refined or as macro as you like. It's pretty exciting. But the objective system it uses On any map, there are 3 points, like in Company of Heroes 2, which are where the artifacts will spawn, and they spawn in after 2 minutes. All 3 artifacts will spawn in, and then you need to get a base runner, which is like a transport, like a defensible transport unit, to pick up the artifact and take it to your score zone. And if you score 5 artifacts, you win. But also, if you destroy your opponent's carrier, you win. And those 2 objectives, I would say, are approximately equally achievable. So,
Which is
like,
brilliant.
Half of the games will end by carrier destruction. It's probably more like 2/3, 1/3 actually. But yeah, so it's a really exciting way of doing it. The games can end really quickly because the artifacts spawn after 2 minutes, and then they spawn like every few minutes thereafter. Like, you constantly are under artifact pressure and military pressure to deal with map control and think about, like, protecting your carrier and dealing with your opponent. And the objectives themselves are interactive and exciting, because if your opponent grabs one of the artifacts, you can attack their base runner, try and stop them from getting it to their score zone. It makes for a lot of interesting positional plays in areas of the map that you wouldn't ordinarily use, because the scoring zones are separate from your spawning zones. So it's a very cool and interesting system that I have to say makes for great games, all of which, I mean, the games can end anywhere from 3 minutes to half an hour, but I would say your average game length is probably 12 to 15 minutes, and I think that they've got it perfect. It just feels as tightly organized as a game of StarCraft 2.
But does the base runner thing, like, you only have one, right? If I understand
You can
this
build
correctly.
them. You can build more.
You can build them. But
Yep.
But if something died, then the game ends. What was that?
The carrier, which is like
Carrier.
the
It's like
carrier
Homeworld
is-
1,
is-
right?
is
Did you
your
play the
base.
original Homeworld?
No.
Okay, well,
It's your big ground.
The command center in CNC. Think about that.
Initial units.
Oh, okay,
yeah.
okay.
And like,
Then
I was
that makes sense.
criticizing the Homeworld series earlier for saying that starting with a thing which has a large amount of HP and defensible turrets necessarily slows down the game because you can't just push in and kill them. What they've done in Homeworld Deserts of Karak is the game focuses around lines of sight, and you can use railguns to defeat enemy targets which are big and have high amounts of health very quickly. So if you research railgun tech and come in with a railgun rush, you can destroy your opponent's carrier, or at least pick off all of their resources, pick off all their harvesters, basically, very quickly. So the fact that you have this huge, like, thing with guns and health doesn't actually slow the game down at all. They've managed that very well.
Yeah, so I feel like victory points and artifacts, they have a similar purpose in that they are a means to provide contention. If it wasn't any victory points in Company of Heroes, it'd be very campy, and like I was with Deserts of Karak, it'd probably be a bit more campy. I mean, maybe not, but it would at least, it would be a bit less aggressive if there wasn't artifacts, because then map control wouldn't be as important. So so
I think it would be a ton less aggressive.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
just a
So
ton.
it
The
makes the
artifacts are
game
everything.
more aggressive, which is what you want, exactly. And there's a lot of ways that you can make the game more aggressive and more, mandate that players fight over the points. The difference between artifact retrieval and victory points, and I think why it's better in Deserts of Karak, singular. Well, actually, no, probably plural. There's a lot of deserts in Karak, isn't there? But anyway.
There are many deserts.
Yeah. Is the fact that you can invest more in artifact retrieval. You can build 3 base runners, and you can cap 3 artifacts at once. If you have the map control and you have the advantage, you can close out the game much quicker. Obviously, the artifacts, they have to respawn after a few minutes or whatever it is, but it means that you can close the game out very, very early on, but very quickly if you have the artifacts. With VPs, even if you get a triple cap, you still have to sit there for, sometimes 10 minutes, especially if you're losing the points over and again. So it feels like VPs would be more interesting as a mechanic if there was like a way that you could make the victory points tick down faster, or if there were more than 3 victory points or something like that.
I think one other point that's like really relevant to bring up is that in Homeworld Deserts of Karak, when you score an artifact, in addition to getting 1 artifact point, which you only need 5 to win, you also get some additional resources to power up your carrier and make it into a better like war machine. So it's not like if your opponent has a triple cap, you're not losing any inherent value other than a number at the top, and the only victory point that matters to you is when you lose the last one. If you lose 100 VPs, you're like, oh no. If you let your opponent get away with 2 artifacts, that's a big advantage. Their carrier is going to be way more powerful. So like they're a resource in and of themselves as well, which is just another interesting thing that the developers have done there.
Yeah, I really like that idea, actually. Like, it sounds really interesting. I might actually give it a go just try it
Dude,
out, get some.
seriously, I cannot recommend that game enough. If you like RTSs, you will love Deserts of Karak.
I'm trying to be like. I'm trying to stay away from games that I think look interesting, so I don't get hooked. Because I have to try to stay on top of my the games I'm
me
casting.
Too, man.
Getting Grandmasters isn't easy.
the GM dream, never there, man.
Yep.
No, but I think it's the dynamic of that, like the incentive to create points of contention, sounds really interesting in Deserts of Karak. Whereas in Company of Heroes, like, I mean, we already touched upon this, of that you barely care about the VPs in the early game, but like they're kind of irrelevant. They're mainly there, to connect things so that I can reinforce with my ambulance or my whatever. That's why I'm holding the VP for the first like 10-15 minutes of the game. And then also the whole thing of where, like, if you've got map control, you can grab a big advantage by having multiple carriers grabbing these artifacts to get bringing them back to your mothership or whatever it is. Whereas I feel there should be some sort of drawback to having not control of all of the VPs, or at least not holding one. Allowing your opponent to hold all three of them. Again, that whole thing would have to be like a redesign of the game, because that would be really imbalanced. But I just feel that there's not really a lot of pressure on any players in the early game. It's to me, when I'm watching a game of Company of Heroes in the early game, it's sort of like, two guys minding their own business, having a bit of a confrontation over like this farm. Like, it doesn't really matter all too much in the big whole thing. Whereas in StarCraft, one early game engagement can mean everything, even though it doesn't look like it does.
How would you guys feel about 1v1 maps that have 4 or 5 VPs?
I would love that.
Yes.
I would love 5 VPs. I would love. Yeah, I would definitely say that would be better, because it would force you to be like, okay,
oh,
no, like I think you would have, because it forces a more, more effort, and forces a more aggressive game from each individual player, which means that any sort of mistake, anything, whenever you lose a squad, it is going to be so much more hurtful to you, because I think that's really good, because it forces players to get better. It forces you to, stay on top of everything, improve, get all of your mechanics, you're like up to par, because otherwise, you're always going to be falling behind. So I think 5 VP would be really good.
But would you rather 5 VPs, or would you rather 3 VPs that tick fast at the rate of 5 VPs?
I'd say 5. I'd rather have 5.
What do you guys think?
I'm just thinking you'd probably have to spread out your units more often.
Insight.
So you wouldn't be able to blob more, right? Isn't that a good thing?
Well, not necessarily. You still don't need to. Keeping the units together doesn't necessarily mean you're blobbing them. I mean,
yeah.
The fact that you've got, for instance, like, that 5 VP map, Montargis region, whatever. You've got VPs everywhere on that map, right? I do like the idea that you could probably, ninja cap the VPs in the corners or something, and do like, because I sometimes like to get like a half track and rush over, then build up defenses and try and control that for the team or whatever. That's kind of cool. But I feel like if in a 1v1 situation, it's just like there's too much to cover. If the map, and the map might need to be bigger. What I would like, for instance, in Company Heroes 1, there was I think a tank mod, was it called Blitzkrieg mod? It might be, where you cap the VPs and you gained a special ability. Now, I know those abilities were quite overpowered, where you could drop bombs out the sky, with the airplanes and stuff. But maybe
Just a mod.
Another incentive. Yeah, there's a mod.
Right.
Another incentive would be to get the VPs would be to get an extra resource. Maybe you got a VP and you got maybe, I don't know, 110 pop. You get an extra 10 pop that you could use. I don't know.
Or if off maps were you paid for them with VPs, like as an example.
Interesting. That's a good idea.
You're onto something.
Holy spoons, buddy! You picked the wrong job.
There, you're onto something. No, honestly, like if we could put Callum on the Company of Heroes like balance team, I wouldn't mind that, because that would at least, because we're on the same page of that. We think that there should be like in-house testing.
Oh well, I appreciate really the compliment. Yeah. I mean, this is kind of, they're related in terms of making the game flow and making the game have interaction and game length. I feel like we can kind of devolve a bit, because I feel like there isn't really much more to talk about as far as actually, you know what? How about we finish this like topic and then we start a new topic completely? How about that?
All right.
Okay, because
depends what the new topic is.
Okay, so it's relevant. I think flow, like in terms of creating interaction, creating like contention. That's kind of what we've been talking about the past 5 minutes. Is like fighting over points and things. Isn't this kind
Yeah.
of relevant?
I agree. It's relevant. Sure.
Yeah. Do you want to do this?
No, yeah, I'm down.
All right, cool. So,
I'm down. Cool.
so we will conclude our thoughts on game length. I personally think that I agree with Hans when it comes to, I think 5 VPs in a 1v1 would be just too convoluted, because it's not just VPs, you have fuel, you have munitions, you have cutoffs. There's a lot of things to manage, and that it would just be an overload of too many things to try and do. But I feel like having the VPs tick faster, I would say, as an estimate, maybe if it was still 500 VPs, but they ticked down at the equivalent of what 400 VPs would be, I feel like that would improve the game length. And I think we all agree on this, is make killing your opponent easier with Annihilation, make that more viable, as well as obviously fix the maps that have bad VP placement. So Tenchi, what's your summary, concluding thoughts on game length in Company of Heroes 2?
I'm a little bit on the other page, where I think that 5 victory points would make things more interesting. You could even run 5 victory points with a slightly higher tick rate, because that way you'd reduce the game length. Or if you have one guy holding 3 and then one guy holding 2, or maybe 2 players controlling 2 each, then obviously it's not going to be ticking anything. So that would still mean that you have potential to see the late game vehicles show up.
Hans?
Yeah, I'd just say remove the base defenses, and allow all players to build demolition charges, or an explosive, or build base defenses or something, so that you could probably lock down VPs easier, remove it off commander choices, and possibly increase the tick rate of VPs. I think that would be good to reduce the game length.
Magpie?
Yeah, I kind of like what I said earlier about how I think the game actually needs massive fundamental changes, and I'm not really a game designer, still applies. But I think if you are going to tweak more simple things that could have a big change, I think you're absolutely right to be looking at the rate at which VPs tick and the number of VPs on the map. So I would love to see some experimentation with that officially supported, maybe in some new maps. That would be great.
Cool.
I think that's the lowest effort way to get the highest impact on the issues that we've been talking about. So
Yeah, I think bigger game modes need more VPs. There is no way that 4v4s should only have 3 VPs when the maps are 3 times as big as a 1v1 map. Because then it's even more of a campy arty fest where you're fighting over the same points over and over again. But anyway, that'll wrap up our thoughts on game length in Company of Heroes 2 and RTS games, though it was mainly just Starcraft and Company of Heroes 2. Hope you've enjoyed this podcast. It was kind of fun. I hope we do more. I don't know if these guys will be keen again another time, but at least I think right now we're going to do a bit of a discussion on game flow and player interactions.
sounds good.
All right, see you guys. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you want to see more RTS discussions and shoutcasts. And of course, follow everyone on Twitter. The Twitter tags are on the screen. Cool. All right, so do you guys have more time? Because I'm keen to talk about more RTS stuff.
I have lots of
I
time.
am slightly multitasking. I am 7-gate stalkering people again.
Really? Wow, okay.
Yep, I'm in his base,
No
man.
respect.
This is about to end.
Cool. All right,
I
Hans, you good?
Yeah, I can do something.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Hans is always good.
Yeah.
I'm still hurting after
Hans
he
is
said
always waiting to
I'm
help
I'm
us.
helping Hans. I'm making productive community
I'm
stuff.
helping.
I live
Yeah.
up to my name. I like Tenchi. I'm still hurting a little bit.
Sweet. All right, cool.
We came to you and we were like, Hans, we're doing a bank job and we need